Good evening, everyone. We're here this evening to have an interview with Dr. Ludwig Hansen, and it is my pleasure to introduce him to you as the laureate of the 8th Roelof Sarel Uitenboogaard Urban Design Memorial Lecture. We're delighted to have you with us this evening, Ludwig. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a few questions so that we can perhaps introduce you to the viewers and wish you well for your lecture later this evening.
Thank you.
Good luck.
I studied in numerous places. I was trained as an architect at the University of Pretoria and then did my master's degree in human settlements at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. And thereafter, I joined the University of the Witwatersrand, where I also concluded my PhD in 2022. I've been fortunate enough with my associations with universities, both as an academic and then eventually as the planner for the University of the Witwatersrand. So the passion for campus design and the faculties and architectural design comes from that perspective. The University of the Witwatersrand was also appointed in 2012 to oversee the implementation of two new universities, the one in Mpumalanga and the Sol Plaatje University in Kimberley, where I was then appointed as the urban designer as part of a greater team. And that involvement has been ongoing for the last 10 to 12 years. My design influences are probably layered. They are from multiple perspectives, maybe because I'm from an architectural background. The first influences were probably more from that perspective. So the idea of the city beautiful, the Beaux-Arts movements, the new urbanist movements, those are sort of important from that perspective. The second sort of influences would be from more the collaborative approaches and the radical planning approaches, with key drivers being people like John Turner and Han Verschuren, and maybe a third is based at the Catholic University of Leuven, which has as a focus landscape urbanism, which has become increasingly relevant in our day and age. The advice that I would give to anyone entering in the urban design profession, I think one has to understand what is a good urban space and what is a good functioning urban city. And I think the first answer would be that it's layered, it has multiple influences. And I think that is the cue for a young urban designer to understand as much as possible and to increase the diversity of the environment they would be working in. Thank you, Namdi. Thank you, Tony, for these very kind words of introduction. Also to the Udisa committee and its members for nominating me, and I trust I will do justice in the lecture as well as in the exhibition to the values and principles embodied by Roelof Uitenboogaard. It's truly fantastic to see so many faces, friends, colleagues, family, and just to see people being brought together like that is fantastic in its own right, and I think that in itself is a success. It's also special to me in the very venue where my professional career started now nearly 40 years ago. As a young, ignorant architecture student, it's actually a shock to say it feels like yesterday when Gus Ganica would whisper his seductive wisdoms to us in this very room. So time truly flies. The lecture topic refers to integrated and connected thinking, which infers that the consolidation of ideas, people, and concepts is actually a notion of joint effort and collaboration, and that this is way more important than the work of the individual. And within this context, words are powerless to express my gratitude to a whole host of people who unselfishly have nurtured my growth from youth to near semblance of maturity at school and university. A special acknowledgement of family who have supported me despite my shortfalls, especially to parents who have never had the opportunity to study themselves, but endeavored their whole life to ensure that their sons have that privilege. A special gratitude and a nod to my 3 brothers who shared my parents' responsibility of rearing me. And then to Ronelle and my 3 daughters, a very special thanks. Thanks also has to go to those who guided my academic process at university. Here at the University of Pretoria, with its numerous dedicated academics and practitioners, the Catholic University of Leuven, which has fostered perspective on a sort of broader understanding of urban and natural environment, which wasn't open to me prior to me studying in Belgium. And lastly, my long involvement at WITS and their dedicated staff, including Namdi, who leads the school with such vigor and without fear, which I think needs a very powerful person to do so. Also, and all the special colleagues that I've met there, without naming too many, but Sulam, Kiki, Lone, Hilton, all of those have been a great support throughout my life. It is through my continuous association with academic life that I've enjoyed opportunities for continued learning from students and peers alike. Equally to those with whom I've had the privilege to work and partner through my professional career, I was and I still am very fortunate to work with some of the best in their respective fields, all of which have generously shared their perspectives and wisdoms and experiences with me. I feel that this is the underlying aspect of the talk, that through our collaboration, that some of the most successful projects and interventions have been concluded. The images I'm showing today and that are also exhibited display a body of work that's over the past now probably 25 years were developed within the South African urban environment. The talk will attempt to provide you with a representation of urban development and the implementation within, first of all, the urban fabrics of African cities, their regeneration and sort of denormalization of marginalized communities, and secondly on work which mostly focused on large institutions and universities. The exhibition downstairs also includes, as a first portion of work, which was concluded over a 15-year period in partnership with Paul Weigers, who sadly passed away in late 2022. Much of the values of this company and the principles we followed at that stage were built on the foundations laid by Steve Thorne, which some of you might still remember, who started Urban Solutions in the 1990s. The drawings of Johannesburg on the screen were always acted as a sort of as an inspiration to Paul and I, and these were done by Steve in the early 1990s. And even though our collaboration sort of ended in 2010, a large proportion of the work and some of the most important work was concluded within that context. Our work at Urban Solutions was within sort of the very exciting and changing context of post-1994. As young urbanists, we, or rather all of us of that age, were faced with the enormity and demand for change in the living condition of so many of our urban citizens, and which created the impression of us not really knowing where to start, as the realities that we were facing were hard to overcome. The status quo plan, showing the eastern portion of Soweto, was so typical of so many urban conditions in the 1990s. It shows the large tracts of vacant land used for mining and industrial purposes, which acted as a buffer to the surrounding neighborhoods, disallowing any form of connection or access to between places to ensure the sort of enforcement of apartheid planning. These areas were faced with an urban form as a tool of control and management. It ensured poor links and connections to the neighbors and the city. It's a deliberate design in architecture that speaks of conformity and the lack of identity, variety, and mixture. All of this in direct contrast with normative or universally accepted urban conditions, which was the basis of the plan that is depicted at the moment. The second portion of the work is, although not exclusively, is more focused on university development, as I've been privileged to be part of a team to develop the two new universities of Mpumalanga and Salt Plaatje in Kimberley, as well as acting as advisor to the Department of Higher Education and Training in many of the other 24 universities. Here I have to mention Spencer Hudson and Dr. Di Parker, who were both mentors to me and the driving guides towards the establishment of these universities. Thanks, Di. I was also privileged through these two new institutions to be offered an opportunity now over 13 years to be part of the establishment, the planning, the design, and implementation. And through the association with WITS and the DHET, I've been fortunate to visit, engage, and guide many of these. It also afforded sort of opportunities for academic exploration and research. Although the exhibition is mostly on urban design, some of the spatial frameworks evolved into architectural projects, which demonstrate the respective spatial guidelines and principles and codes of those urban designs. And these include the civic interventions of taxi and trader interchanges and also markets, trader markets. More recently, I've been involved and privileged, or we've been privileged to design and develop academic institutional buildings as well as the support infrastructure at universities, for instance, laboratories and residences, as mentioned earlier. The final component of the exhibition speaks to research and involvement at the University of the Witwatersrand and the research unit called the Campus Innovation Laboratory, which I'm partnering with Professor Ella, which has a focus the design and development of large institutions or institutional plans, implementation of infrastructure within the South African context. Returning to the focus of the talk, the primary premise is centered around sort of 5 distinct principles or themes, which are really interrelated, and through which projects and urban designs have been developed over the last couple of years, but also have guided the decision-making processes. The first principle is focused on the nature of what is an urban design framework and the scale of its intervention. Secondly, the urban design is viewed as a collective process, which with the value of participatory design as a key driver. Thirdly, the application of inquiry by design as a means to engage with broad stakeholder needs and their requirements. Fourthly, the importance of placemaking and its supporting theories. And finally, that implementation of spatial frameworks and strategies to ensure realization are an essential part of what we need to do. Before discussing these 5 themes and principles, I'd like to step back and sketch the context within which we work. The slide taken from Diepkloof, Soweto, across the N1 freeway, looking over the 3 main slime dumps edging Nasrec, and the World Cup final stadium looks towards Johannesburg, inner city, skyline in the background. The image captures the near sinister uncomfortableness of my urban home. The city on the hill is a near unreachable distance away, buffered from Soweto by a belt of mining land. It is ironic that mining for gold has both shaped the positive as well as the negative faces of our city. On the one side, it enabled its establishment. On the other, it was used to create an insurmountable division between its citizens. Johannesburg, which I'll call home, has become a field of violent contests between extreme wealth and extreme poverty, between luxury and subsistence, excess and need. It further shows the sprawl of our suburbs and our dependence on vehicular transport via huge freeway systems. And Clark Chipkin was convinced to put this picture on the cover of his book on Joburg because it summarizes our Joburg so very well with all its contradictions. All too often there are reports of escalating crime and violence, and the poor, desperate to find someone to live, often are forced to contribute to environmental disasters by building either on unstable sites next to rivers or occupied buildings unsuited for housing, often with very, very tragic results, as was the case in August last year when a former government building in Joburg inner city burnt and killed 77 people. To compound the disparity, the last decade has seen the systematic failure of our infrastructure. Bulk electricity supply is intermittent. The road and transport network is failing, and of late the supply of water as a resource has become not only unreliable but unsafe for consumption. To top all of this, we were confronted with a COVID pandemic, which utterly destroyed communities, people's livelihoods, and a sense of optimism. As urbanists, we seem helpless to stem the decay of our cities or show an ability to transform them, possibly due to our persistent attachment to conformist view that cannot be compared to the cultural, political, and economic diversity that shapes our African cities. By attempting to address these aspects in a very small manner, or in a small way, through the 5 principles mentioned, the first speaks to the nature and the scale of urban design and its intervention. To illustrate this, I will refer to the University of the Witwatersrand Braamfontein campus plan, which was based on a competition-winning entry in 1980 by Leon and Fallon, which really followed Beaux-Arts design principles. The plan included imposing central block, which was flanked by academic buildings, has as its focal space what we call now the library lawn, which all the way slopes down all the way to Parktown. I was fortunate to have worked with Dave Diwa and Piet Lowe some now 15 years ago, and I do owe them a great word of gratitude for their shared knowledge in urban design methodologies and the nature of the plan in urban design. Hereby, the urban plan needs to be minimalist, not comprehensive. It needs to be strong enough to give firm direction to spatial decision-making, but at the same time flexible enough to accommodate change, which is demonstrated by the original plan. The plan also illustrates the purpose of a spatial framework, which in this example controls the evolution of the campus over a 100-year period. The key driver is not the building, but the focal space, in this case the library lawn. It is the primary structuring device around which subsequent buildings have been constructed to create a coherent campus. The visual axis is focused on the swimming pool, which was one of the first things that were built, strangely enough, at the university, together with 2 towers on either side of it. It has as a focal device the Great Hall. And if you look carefully, you would notice that there is no building behind it. It is only a screen. It's a theatre piece. And the only things that were really built were the academic buildings. So there is something theatrical about how this campus was set about. And what is fundamental, though, is the shared space, which continuously guided the university over time. Just by the way, it's only in the 1940s that something real happened behind that facade. The formal rigor of the original plan steered the positioning of buildings over the next decades, with buildings positioned to strengthen that original actual arrangement. So it becomes a roadmap, and I think that is what the spatial framework is. It's a roadmap over time to structure an institution in this case. Although Wits I must admit, collectively has probably the ugliest architectural pieces in existence. The structure of that space gives it coherency, and it is truly a beautiful campus. So keep that in mind. We don't all have to be beautiful architecture to to ensure that. Just also as a way of maybe further example, in 1984, Wits acquired the agricultural showgrounds on the other side of the freeway. And here there was a complete lack of structure, as we can see, dominated by vehicular movement and the like. The open space quality and logic was poor, and this has become the primary focus of what we have been trying to do over the last 15 years, is to improve in a similar way the open space quality of that Western campus in a similar way that we had it originally within the East Campus. All right, moving on to the issue of scale. I'm not sure I'm the only one who feels completely overwhelmed by issues of urban decay, regeneration processes, and the sheer scale of the challenges that we face. So sometimes doesn't know where we want to start. And the image, although not an urban one, highlights the sort of challenges we also experience in our natural and productive landscapes. In this case, the devastation caused by coal mining in Mpumalanga. And in my view, also an overwhelming scenario in how to deal with that. I'm using this as an extreme example as some of the possible solutions to this devastating impact offer me great encouragement in dealing also with urban challenges. Here I refer to research concluded at this very institution by Dr. Dabrowski, which introduced a dung beetle and cattle farming as a means to revitalize devastated mining leftovers. In a theme which I will introduce later, it's sometimes the small intervention which acts as a catalyst for substantial and sustained improvements to rehabilitate degraded soil in this case. It might not do I might not do justice to this research, but the idea that the small intervention should not be overlooked in dealing with the issues. In a similar fashion, introducing smaller intervention can act as a catalyst to revitalize urban areas or activate dead street edges. Whilst designing our home and office in Parkview, Joburg, opposite a primary school, I introduced a simple large barn door opening into the inner courtyard of the house, fitted with a bench and a water fountain. This small gesture quickly became a waiting station for parents. Children used it as a gathering point to safely cycle and skateboard. Cyclists and joggers realigned the routes to pass the water point. And the local security patrol is using it as a waiting station. This seemingly insignificant intervention demonstrates that we should not discard the small idea, which have equal value in the regeneration of our very, very tough urban settings. The second principle, and the main maybe the main body or the thrust of this talk, is centered around the idea that urban design is a collective process, a collaboration between multiple stakeholders. In my view, similar to Hegeman and Dwayne in Zybrek, the city and its urban condition is essentially a people's art, a shared experience, a participation on a grand scale to express values, to which its citizens give credence. It is thus the task of us as urban designers to conceive an idea, implant it and nurture it, grow with it in the collective minds of the community. From this, I believe that involvement is the key spatial experience. And we as urban designers should strive for total involvement with our urban environment and think holistically to achieve an integrated and pleasing mosaic of spaces and places. I've also come to understand, through my practice experience at least, that our South African urban environments are fraught with complexities that require a broader, in-depth understanding of the inner workings, that they need to be integrated with urban form on varied levels and must involve citizens in order to ensure a clearer way forward. I subscribe to the perspective that the city can be defined as a sort of man-made ecosystem requiring much diversity to sustain itself. The diversity inherent in cities has developed organically over time, and the varied components are so interdependent in so many ways. Diversity in spatial design doesn't only reference mixed-use buildings or typologies and functions and users, but also the methodology to engage with the end user. The incorporation into the design process of as broad as possible a sample of those stakeholders is important to ensure a sustainable result. The principle of participation, in my view or in my experience, are best demonstrated in projects involving what I call the informal users of our cities, the street traders and the taxi industry in Johannesburg. A large part of my work in the late 90s, 1990s that is, and in 2000s, revolved around working with the informal users of our city. Broader participation played a significant role to establish firstly spatial strategies, but also civic building responses to a sector largely ignored. And these by ignoring that, I think these things had dire consequences in terms of how our cities function. It is through these projects that I came to understand that we get to learn who we are chiefly through contact with others, since members of the community hold the collective personality, keep the collective personality. With sustained connections and continued conversations, participants and communities, regardless of degree of inclusion, we develop emotional bonds, intellectual pathways to mutually understand and then create better abilities to problem solving. It's only through layered and collective collaboration that sustained design solutions can be achieved. It also offered a framework to ingrain or incorporate the unrecognized in our city, and in this case, the taxis and the traders. The minibus taxis and informal traders became increasingly prominent in our cities in the 1980s, growing over time into industries of sizable proportions, impacting the city in an increasing manner. And due to the informal beginnings and operations, they were long regarded as illegal citizens, and therefore exposed to abuse, extortion, and forceful removals. And whilst not provided with any status within the city, they occupied whatever space available or underutilized land, the city, be it pavements or vacant land. The city council and Joburg realized very quickly that they had to address the needs and requirements of both the taxis, and the traders. Together with the Joburg Inner City Office, under the leadership of Graham Reed at that stage, we developed the Inner City Street Trader Management Strategy, which involved a survey and multiple work sessions with traders. The resultant proposal aimed to integrate the street traders into the mainstream urban economy by giving them legal status and by establishing a series of market spaces for them to trade from. Hereby, street traders were moved off the street into centralized markets, and the very first example is the one on the screen, which is the Yeovil market. The new building typology in Yeovil, pardon me, I think I skipped one. Yeah. The new building typology in Yeovil, although viewed with skepticism at the beginning, has grown to become very successful and still operates 20, 30 years later, way beyond my own expectation, and despite being painted an even greener green than I specified 30 years ago. It still really holds a special place, in my memory at least, of Joburg in the 1990s. Realizing that street traders could not sustain themselves independent from other city functions and activities, projects were initiated which followed a more integrative approach, incorporating traders with taxis, buses, and formal retail. The design of Metro Mall, completed in 2002, applied the same principles we followed in Yeovil, but on a far larger scale. And in this case, dealing with over 200,000 commuters on a daily basis, 2,500 minibus taxis, and 800 traders. The building complex formed part of a large urban design framework involving quite extensive engagement with taxis and traders, and over 70 stakeholder engagements resulted in the flow and use of program that would not have been possible if we just followed a brief like we would done traditionally. Apart from ensuring greater buy-in, the engagement brought about the realization that the taxi industry deserved a building or of civic stature equal to traditional public buildings, like a train station, for example. The architecture also indicates a significant shift in approach to dealing with public buildings for the sector, especially a sector of our society marginalized in the past. It presents itself with pride, a sense of arrival, avoiding sort of the stereotypes that we see of taxi ranks, which are mostly of flimsy construction. And if anything, the buildings at least display a sense of permanence, moving away from the temporary structures that we see dotted around. Unfortunately, the arduous consultation at Metro Mall had a stark reality check. On the official opening, the Taxi Association completely reversed the endlessly discussed vehicular movement process. And the building still worked. And the lesson learned from that is that we tend to design too structured. We tend to over-design the places and spaces that our people occupy. And I think that was the difference when we developed the Baragwanath transport interchange and markets over a 1.5 kilometer site. It became far more robust, allowing a more open-ended end use of the structure of traders and taxis in the way they would like. A further lesson in collaboration with the taxis and traders was a realization that the process of architecture, and even more so when we built our cities, this process becomes so institutionalized that people seldom have an outlet to put their own intuition into use. And during these trader projects, many ways were researched how to integrate and benefit the end user, who often is unemployed and poor, into that construction process. A variety of schemes, for example, an artworks program was established to get artists of the immediate community to decorate the buildings. The same was applied when appointing also smaller subcontracts and the like. This process or program and the resultant artworks not only is beneficial to the community, but it makes the building and structure something the end user very much associates with. Broad participation is also a key element within the urban design process, applied with varying degrees of success. One of the most demanding examples was a peri-urban development with the aim of integrating community-owned land into the Umtata city in the Eastern Cape. Not so much design, but the process of releasing the land over time, ensuring a productive landscape while slowly developing one portion to the next. The design of the approach and engagement with the affected stakeholder was by far the most intensive part of the design, or the development framework at least. This also speaks to implementation plans that make large-scale and also more feasible. The collective approach was also a key method in the development of the two new universities, the University of Mpumalanga and Sol Plaatje University in Kimberley, with the latter being the better example, as this was more integrated into the fabric of Kimberley and had to merge with a greater number of stakeholders. Much of the planning methodology was based on what we would call radical planning and participatory approaches, with a focus on decentralizing planning process to involve broader input in urban and community projects. Despite the fact that universities in South Africa are often insular islands, I view campuses as an integral part of our civic urban space, which demands input from all those impacted. Our university they occupy such large tracts of the inner cities, impacting vastly on the surrounding urban environment, as highlighted in the shown examples. In the more established institutions, the same also applies to the inclusion of city officials, neighboring property owners and businesses, as well as student representation, who play a key role in informing the urban design, as is in the case of Stellenbosch and possibly also Rhodes, where the growth of the institution has from its inception been an integral part of the city fabric, and it's through sort of the input of those and in participation that the sense of ownership is developed, which I think improves the quality of that city. Improved collaboration also finds solid footing, although not uniquely so, in the use of competitions as a form of ensuring greater variety in large urban institution development. Part of Melrose' initial success was not only due to its clear spatial structure and development framework, but the client was also convinced to introduce an architectural competition for at least the first phase. Its success was not only creating a platform for good new urban ideas to prosper, but further through this enforced sort of a greater joint effort and input, resulting, in my view, a very, very successful project. With the development of these very strict architectural brief and codes at Osman Lang, which was a very valuable lesson to me, it also offered a number of young emerging architects an opportunity to participate in a process which is not open normally to them. It's always sort of guarded by the larger firms. This, again, was unfortunately lost in further phases of Melrose as increasingly larger blocks were developed. The same process of competition and participation and creating a broader group of participants was also applied in the development of the Department of Trade and Industry, or the DTI campus in Sunnyside. Although the client's insistence on covering the public space with a roof is probably not the most successful design idea I participated in. So I've got some howlers out there, believe me. But the incorporation of broader professionals and stakeholders requires also guidelines and codes, establishing for these multiple designs teams to collaborate. Working with a variety of groups is a painful experience, and to establish a medium between conformity and individual expression is no easy task. In my experience, a very successful example of competition as an element of collaboration, again, was in the establishment of the two new universities, in Solplaatje and Mpumalanga. This was in contradiction to older university precedents, especially the 1970s and 80s. For example, the appointment of Meyer and Van Wyk to design the Rand Afrikaans University in 1967, without any recorded open competition process, despite this being the largest single building projects post-1994. The sort of same single source appointment of Brian Sandrock was also applied in Udisa. The complexity in our work in dealing with those campuses on the spatial framework together with Activate, the difficulty of adding and changing that because of the singularity of the design, and it's so difficult because of the structured nature of those campuses, and any addition to them is quite difficult. In the development of Solplaatje and UP, the appointment of a single architectural practice was therefore also rejected in favor of multiple design grouping. It was argued that employing a single architecture would lead, no matter how good or experienced that architect is, or those design teams, to systemization, repetition, and monumentality, as was the case in the Rao and Unisa example. A further example, a further argument, which I think is a much stronger one, was that these precedents were completed prior to the expansion of the academic program, and therefore it sort of impose a premeditated character on the university. Instead, at the new university, it was argued that the architecture should evolve with the growth of the university, but set within a spatial framework which offers guidance without dictating all terms of spatial expression. A further departure from the traditional design competition processes was that not once, as I said, not one single winning entry was selected. In Kimberley, of the 9 submissions received in the second stage, 5 were recommended for appointment and 4 in UMP. And this created a whole new environment, and probably the success of the architecture is apparent. The spatial guidelines, although viewed originally quite restrictive, still results in a diverse architectural expression, and it's definitely worth a visit. I will also present the architect to the architecture students if they arrive tomorrow, some of the projects and their approaches and methodologies, because I don't think they're that interested in the urban side as yet. So you probably tell me if they're around, or inform me at least. What's up? A critical part in larger group participation and to make it operational and doable are the guidelines and the codes it requires to ensure coherency and a holistic end result. The example of Devonbosch and Stellenbosch, which I'm doing in collaboration with Henry Comrie as a case in point. When observing how urban developments are approached in South Africa, it is typically through an overtly rigid architectural guideline, often dictating style, color, and finishes to the T, whilst having very poorly defined envelopes, or describing any of the urban and larger scale aspects. I would argue that it should be the inverse, where the guidelines for the envelope, defining example the height, the location of landmarks, the entrances, the ground floor uses, the active edges, are strictly managed, but the architectural articulation is open for interpretation. Much of my work revolves around establishing guidelines for spatial implementation, without compromising on the overall coherency of an urban area, nor to dictate to the institution, the city, the developers, or the design teams. Spatial guidelines can be described as offering a roadmap, even though the final destination might not be known. Applying Christopher Alexander's ideas, the aim is to describe the core features of a solution to a specific spatial challenge in a way that you can use the solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it in the same way twice. The spatial guideline is contrasted with the idea of a rule, which offers a specific roadmap to implement any given situation. The pattern in contradiction raises issues that may need attention, and it provides ideas and examples of what could be done to readdress or address them. Thus, while a rule bypasses people's intuition, a guideline calls upon these very intuitions and attempts to educate and strengthen them in the process of solving the problem. The field of study on spatial guidelines and coding is an extensive one, which maybe a brief discussion like this does not do justice, but I would encourage urban designers to place much emphasis on this as an important means towards an improved holistic urban development and its implementation. Inquiry by design is a third idea which is an extension of the collaborative approach. I would briefly want to share it in its relevance to an urban design methodology. I believe that it supports participatory approaches as a means for exchange and extracting information from stakeholders and participants in the design process. This is a key method in the design of very complex urban interventions and projects, and was successfully applied in this example of Tamimanyele Park in Tembisa, where design proposals and ideas were presented to the community for them to respond, draw, and comment in numerous sessions. The approach stands in opposition to a linear practice engagement, where planning begins with consultants being appointed to do work with a particular result in mind, with results hinging on gathering as much survey information up front, analyzing this, and then designing a master plan, and then presenting it to the stakeholders as a fait accompli. The inquiry by design aims to integrate constituents activities or imagining, presenting and testing, and through a trial and error process, it allows the designer to test input and conjectures offered by multiple stakeholders. This creates a constant shift of a possible final result, in line with new information received, which take the form of conceptual shifts, or what I call creative leaps. As designers, we aim to reach one acceptable response within a range of possible solutions or a domain of acceptance. The cyclical nature of inquiry by design allows changes to take place without the need to restart the process. To demonstrate by example, at the University of Salt Lake, stakeholder sessions and decision-making workshops were structured to allow maximum access to the design process. A 5-day workshop within the Kimberley Municipality building, directly adjacent to the earmarked university site, was set up. Planning meetings and direct consultations were held with stakeholders, which included the local municipality, the provincial government, public institutions, private landowners, and affected citizens. Every morning, a session from 8 to 12 was allocated for discussion with stakeholders and technical consultants, allowing the urban design team to develop their input further during the afternoon. An open invitation to view the day's work and to give input from 4 o'clock onwards was advertised. The method of inquiry by design enabled stakeholders to immediately see the impact of their comments and input. The ideas and inputs were visually displayed on large drawings like the one behind me, allowing stakeholders a better understanding of the campus development. This approach allowed the development of a design of the university campus to be expedited, as rapid decisions could be made with the affected parties and stakeholders close at hand. Work sessions resulted in the first conceptual presentation to a full sitting of the Salt Lake Municipal Council on the 5th day, which was also open to the public. All of these sessions were well attended, and the input established a better understanding of the nature of the institution and the nature and structure of the city. And the plan of the new university was promoted and seen as the plan of the city. This meant that the spatial framework for the institution was viewed as a collaborative approach, a collaborative effort, and not one imported by the Department of Higher Education and their clever urban designer. The first, as a further example, the first comprehensive workshop resulted in a framework which hasn't altered for nearly 10 years. It's still the same, despite some small changes to functional or technical informants. But an example is one of the first ideas was to create a clearly defined student walk linking the 3 sub-campuses. And this was refined in the spatial design framework document, which was approved. And the same student walk was has formed the backbone around which implementation was and is still structured, and resulting in a coherency and connectivity which was aimed for in the original work sessions. And it's still sort of the element of identity within the larger campus. The fourth principle revolves around the concept of placemaking. So what should be considered to ensure a great sense of civicness? What then is deemed important, especially in our case, if not the provision of services? The question I've been confronted more often than most when dealing with larger civic issues and urban design is that, what is the fuss? Why bother with the regeneration of civic space? Surely the salient issues should be housing, water, electricity, roads. And why bother with urbanity, with the constant bickering to create quality urban or public space? Public placemaking and the importance of the public realm, I'm of the opinion, has 2 primary roles. Firstly, it is the dwelling place of our civic life. And secondly, it is the physical manifestation of the common good. When we degrade the public realm, we automatically degrade the quality of our civic life and what our society stands for. The quality of our public environment and the ability to create spaces which are worth caring about comes from a sort of culture of civic design, a body of knowledge, method, and skill utilized over centuries, which we as planners and architects, as in many cases, increasingly ignored. Consequently, we do see the results all around us. We have created an environment where the emphasis is moved from the civic or the public to the private. We have ensured that a greater part of our cities are not worth caring about. We have created streets, squares, and public space not worth looking after. Who gives a damn about the litter and grime if the spaces we have designed look like this, which is in fact a large proportion of our environment? Why care for public space or street when it's not designed to care for you? And streets, for example, have become vehicular conduits only. And engineers and planners have completely forgotten that a great proportion of our society has no access to private means of transport to begin with. The aim, thus, is to create proud public space, a sense of place, a place worth caring for. It's so important because not only it informs us where we are geographically, but also who we are in our culture, where we come from, what kind of people we are, and it affords us a glimpse to where we are going. And maybe most importantly, it allows us to dwell in the hopeful present. If we look at the civic spaces we have around us, we have to ask if they reflect what we are about or want to become. And how does the architecture we create inform or distract from that very discourse? The emphasis and principle I emphasize that we have a responsibility to create common spaces worth caring for. So what makes good civic and public space and what ensures a sense of place? And to quote James Kunstler, it's primarily dependent on our ability to define spaces by employing the vocabulary, syntaxes, rhythms, and patterns of architecture. This is our responsibility as planners and designers. We cannot remove ourselves from that responsibility. We are too long, our architecture in broad terms and developments have removed themselves from the public environment or the public edge, and the long-term sustainability of our cities is not assured, therefore. We have a narcissist position, which has shifted from the shared and common towards the private. Placemaking is a primary driver of all the urban design projects, and in my view finds its clearest expression in the Salt Lake Central Campus Square, where the space invites activities and events and shapes the surrounding building edges in terms of activity, landmarking, entrances and functions. Like the methodologies of inclusion, participation and placemaking, the understanding of normative design qualities have equal value. Having qualified first as an architect, the spatial principles of form, order, scale, proportions, organization, structural logic, hierarchy, and repetition also establish a foundation of assessing our design and is an important part of that. Despite my dislike for an architectural profession that has moved increasingly towards isolationist expressions which ignore the broader context, the rigor of architecture's formal language and the principles of assembly are a foundational reference when designing open spaces. The last principle, and I know it's quite hot, it won't keep you much longer. The last principle revolves around implementation and implementation strategies. I view that urban design frameworks as a strategy should provide the basic long-term structure around which shorter-term implementation decisions can take place, all of which inform and enhance a balanced future vision. The underlying principle when addressing phasing for a project of the scale of a university or a town centre is that it has to create its own urbanity and sense of identity right from the word go. Most large-scale developments, from my experience, have an ad hoc approach with the final vision only apparent in 15 or 20 years. The aim of a spatial framework is to establish a microcosm of the completed urban project from day one. The phasing pattern should not, as usually happen, focus on buildings and infrastructure, but on complete common space as a starting point. The aim is to create a complete piece of urban intervention, preferably around a park or a square as a first step. Further phases should then extend upon that, either by extending the street. An example, again to demonstrate, is to use that central campus square at Salt Lake. The university was officially launched in 2013, September, and as part of the implementation strategy, the central campus square was designed and constructed as the very first step, before any buildings were built. The aim was to showcase the quality that the new university wanted to embody and to display its intention always to converse with the city. The square was laid out. Numerous banners depicting future buildings and intentions of the new universities were placed around the square. And from the inauguration onwards, people from the city would visit the square, read the banners, have picnics, play soccer, and watch the buildings around the central square. Subsequent phases for the university campus aim to systematically add complete pieces around that central space, and then further along the central student walk, as I mentioned earlier. Phasing in this manner reduces not only upfront infrastructure spend, but it builds confidence with the construction team, the city officials, and all the stakeholders as the picture is developed from early on what the complete campus is aiming to become. This all sounds too good to be true in a sense. And of course, not all experiences have had the same positive implementation outcome. Paul Weigers and I in the early 2000s embarked on investing in the inner city ourselves. We bought the old flour mills with 6 adjacent buildings in Newtown, which back then was part of a larger 26 property sale by Premier Mills. Over an 8-year period, we toiled energetically to regenerate the buildings and their immediate surrounds. The experience was a valuable one and with some commendable results, but ultimately failed due to the lack of broader partnerships and collaboration, primarily on the side of the city in this case. I did start this conversation on the magnitude of urban challenges, and the Johannesburg inner city must rate as one of those that face the worst. Our Mills precinct development had demonstrated it's impossible for the individual or the single organization to emanate a turnaround. Only in the collective it becomes tangible. Organizations, for example, currently Josie My Josie in Johannesburg, which is an urban regeneration interest group, has established a platform to connect people who want to make a difference, from private to public sector, to inspire sustainable solutions, etc. It is this collective initiative which offer viable propositions of urban regeneration. Their approach is no different in terms of the implementation strategy I mentioned earlier. Complete a small piece of urban space, a section, a street, or just a portion of pavement, all within a greater framework to eventually stitch complete spaces of urban renewal. I would encourage you to investigate smaller organizations in your own, or similar organization in your own city or neighborhood, as the self-help initiatives do offer a great vehicle of hope in turning around our cityscapes. In conclusion, I want to stress the value of reflective practice as an approach of inquiry aimed at continuous improvement of oneself and of the profession I work in. As an urban design and architectural practitioner, I experience a continuously busy pace in the daily workflow, not very conducive to reflection, learning and growth. Personally, reflecting on projects and concluded work is an important professional learning tool, as I believe that experience alone does not result in continuous growth, but that the deliberate reflection on experience is essential. In this, the privilege to deliver the Ludolf Uitenboogaard Memorial Lecture and its accompanying exhibition forces assembly of forgotten projects, drawings and ideals, reflections on paths and decision-making. This is really deeply appreciated. With that privilege in mind, I want to offer a special thanks to the Udisa committee and its members for affording me this very special opportunity and for their unselfish support to deliver the lecture and exhibition. To the University of Pretoria for generously providing the space, the sponsors for their generous donations, and then all the support from staff and colleagues, with a special thanks to Ronel Wasserman. I thank you for listening so patiently. Thank you.